Hey everybody, Coach here. Hey, thanks for taking a couple of minutes. Hey, I'm not here to insult anybody's intelligence, but staking of trees is merely for the initial straightness or alignment in a vertical orientation of ornamental trees that we put in our yards and in the ground. I guess man believes all trees should be vertical because that is how Mother Nature grows them, right? And it does make sense to a certain degree. But if you look in some cases though, Mother Nature also creates trees that grow at angles and weird wind-swept architecture of the trees. Take for instance the Monterey coastline of California in the US. I mean, people travel from all over the world to see the Monterey cypress that are wind sculpted and decorated by Mother Nature and the prevailing ocean winds there for thousands and thousands of years. Those trees were never staked. They're not oriented in a vertical orientation. So staking of trees is necessary? Or is it just simply because everyone does it? Now, coming from the contractor world and the quote professional world of landscaping, I stake trees all the time. Most of the time it was because of the delta breezes and winds that I had in the area that I was practicing in Northern California. We did have, during certain parts of the year, prevailing winds that came out of the coastal area and came through the Carquinez Straits and across the Delta and out into the Central Valley. It was basically our summer air conditioning. And when it was cranking hard, it was wonderful, beautiful place to live. When the Delta breezes shut off in the summertime is when we reached the high 90s and the 100s. But when it came to staking the trees, if there was quite a bit of exposure, front yard that doesn't have a break in the wind from other houses or whatever, yeah, we stake trees. The other reason we stake trees was because maybe the designer called for it, or the architect called for it, or city building codes called for it. Now, with all that being said, is it necessary? I mean, here at Brook and Pond, we planted 6 Parkland pillar birches. They were 10-gallon specimens. We planted 3 in the backyard in the boulder island, and we planted 3 in the front yard. And the only stake they had is the small half-inch bamboo planter stake that was done when they were initially planted in their containers. When we put them in the ground, we did not stake them. And they have gone through, in this growing season, probably a good half a dozen, maybe 8, really good windy days. Whether it was storm or whether it was just wind, there was some times when those guys got whipped around just a little bit. And there was times where I said, maybe I should have. But in the end, you know what? They're still vertical. They're still doing just fine. And come springtime, I'll take the little bamboo stake out and they'll be on their own. Now, before I recorded this, I went out to these trees and I actually did a little tug and a shake. And it's amazing, the ones in the backyard that went in June, you could tell the rigidity of the trunk and certainly the establishment of the root ball compared to when they went in the ground. And that is now 5 months, 6 months almost. And you could tell that the tree established itself and it has stood up to the environment that we put it in really, really well. And I'll tell you, I think that staking trees is a necessary evil in some situations to protect the investment that you're spending. I mean, my gosh, these 10-gallon Parkland pillars cost $165 a piece up here in northern Maine, which for me was just gobsmack sticker shock. I've never paid that much for that type of tree. I would expect a 24-inch box specimen for something that pricey out on the West Coast. But up here, it takes a lot to get nursery material this far north. So you're paying for all the fuel costs and the markup and blah, blah, blah. But if you're putting hundreds, if not thousands or tens of thousands of dollars into a landscape project and part of that landscape project requires trees of various sizes, and you live in an area where at certain times of the year, or when certain storms like derechos up in the Dakotas, hurricanes and tropical storms down south, West Texas, New Mexico, southern Colorado, eastern Arizona, your spring winds. I mean, 20 miles an hour is kind of a calm day down there. Then staking those trees for a particular period of time does make sense to protect the investment. Will the tree still live if you didn't? Yeah, probably. Will it probably grow at a slight angle? Maybe. But eventually it's going to correct itself, and it's going to grow as Mother Nature intended it to grow. For me, that's the only reason why I would stake trees. And the biggest mistake contractors, ground maintenance crews, homeowners make is that they leave the stake in place too long. And anything more than a single growing season, I think, is a waste of the strengthening and the self-sustainability that tree has the capability of being and doing, because you're kind of getting into that broken leg analogy. You know, many years ago, if you broke your leg, you were thrown into a cast, and that cast stayed on for a minimum of like 8 weeks. And then when you were done with it, the cast was cut off, and you got an ACE wrap and a little bit of support, and you were kind of on your own. And yet in modern medical theories now is you may get a cast, maybe, but most likely it's kind of a walking cast. And you're kind of put back into, the bone is reset, you're put into a walking cast and support, and maybe you got some crutches, and you get to physical therapy, and that leg is rehabbed quicker and strengthened quicker than in days gone by. And it turns out that, hey, the body takes care of itself. Well, trees are kind of the same way. If they're put into an environment where the environment tends to beat on them from one side or another, from wind or strong storms, Mother Nature has a way of sending the root system out in the direction that it needs to support the tree, and it creates its trunk and its fibrous inner workings, shall we say, without getting too scientific here. The tissues strengthen up and the trunk thickens up in order to preserve the tree itself. And so by staking it for a long period of time, that root system doesn't strengthen quite as much. That trunk system and the scaffolding of the branches don't get a chance because they have this crutch that's holding them in place. And the tree goes, I'll just hang out here. I don't need to get strong. I don't need to develop a lot of roots to combat this environment I'm in. And oftentimes, I've seen stakes that are left in place so long that the stakes rot out at ground level. And they're sitting there half being held up by the ties that were put in place. And the tree is perfectly straight, or it has a very top-heavy canopy with kind of a whippy trunk. And that's where you start to get that curved trunk, or in some cases, you'll get the fracture of the trunk and a shattering of the trunk because the trunk was never allowed to strengthen enough to support the canopy that is now growing. So a good rule of thumb approaching this topic is stake if you need to, but only if you need to. And if you do stake, 1 season or less. If you plant in April, you should be pulling that stake out for all intent and purposes by September, by the end of the growing season. And you can do some, kind of like what I did here at Brook and Pond. You can get out there and you can wiggle and you can check. You can tell when a tree is still whippy. You can tell if the root system hasn't established itself yet. You'll see that root ball move around still. But if you're not seeing that, and that trunk seems to be a lot more rigid than when you put it in the ground, it's time to get rid of that crutch and take the tie off and take the stake out and store it for the next tree if they're still in good shape. So, a good insurance policy against having to stake long term is this. Number one, you're going to build good planting technique for every tree you put in the ground. You're going to go as deep as the root ball, or maybe slightly more. You're going to do half again as wide as the root ball is wide. You're going to do a good 50-50 mix of the native soils and a good soil amendment. And you're going to use the proper dosage of a little starter fertilizer. And then when you put that heavy root ball in the ground, which, let's face it, the root ball, when wet, is a heck of an anchor all on its own. And then when you put it in the ground, you compact this new planting hole around that, which you're creating many pounds of holding power. And then you're going to water it by creating a water basin, and you're going to water it, which is going to add more weight to it. You've created quite an anchor initially already. Now, if you have a stupendous buy on redwoods or birch trees or crepe myrtles or whatever you bought, oftentimes during the growing season you have the canopy that's up there. And the canopy can often be kind of a wind sail, kind of a catch-all for the wind. And that does put stress and strain on the trunk as well as the root ball itself. But a little stress and strain will make that tree get strong in a darn quick hurry. And towards the end of my contracting practices, I never had more than one stake in the ground. Even if an architect called for 2 stakes, I would call them up and say, if I just use a stake on the windward side, will that satisfy you? And they go, yeah, I have to put in what I have to put in, just do what you're going to do. And that's how I approached a lot of the trees that we planted at Weed Patch Ranch before we moved. And that's how I've gone even the next degree away of I'm not even using a stake up here. Mother Nature's forests up here in northern Maine, their neighbor is their stake. And sometimes that creates a little natural environment conundrum, because oftentimes if you have a neighbor that's right next to you supporting you and you're supporting them, well, sometimes the trees don't get a bigger root system as they probably should. And I noticed a lot of the mature maples and birches and firs and spruces up here have a very shallow root system. And when a big wind comes through and it does topple, when I see that root ball come up out of the ground, I'm going, damn, that was like 12 inches deep. And that's it. But the neighbor held that tree up for a long time. And that's how Mother Nature does it in the forest up here. Well, in the suburbs, in the city streetscapes, not so much. You know, they're kind of on their own. So a little bit of staking for a short period of time. I'll share a quick story with you, and that was back in 1989. I can remember working in the city of Alameda when the Loma Prieta earthquake came through. And I was on one of the West End streets working when that earthquake hit. And the city had just planted and improved some of the sidewalk streetscape there on Webster Street. And they planted a bunch of ficus nitidas, and they had not come back through and staked them. And I remember coming out of a business after visiting with the owner when this particular earthquake happened, and it was a biggie. And I came out, and I still remember to this day those ficus nitidas, and they were literally, it was like the Incredible Hulk shaking, what's his name, in the Thor movie. It was one of those things, Puny King. And the ficus nitidas were just going from sidewalk, whipping over to sidewalk, going back and forth. Fortunately, the ficus are very flexible when they're young, but I still remember, man, those things should really have a stake. And I'll never forget that picture of looking up and down Webster Street and seeing all the new trees just whipping back and forth. So, if a stake was there, would it have mattered, you know, with a 6.8 earthquake? I don't know. It was something that struck me at that time and will stay with me the rest of my life. So, in some parts of our country in the U.S., particularly the upper Midwest, Dakotas, Nebraska, Wyoming, the old song, "When the wind comes sweeping down the plain," is a real thing. And during certain times of the year, winds blow out of the northwest up there like crazy. Also in the early springtime down in the southwest, I can remember Maestro and I coming through Texas and New Mexico, eastern Arizona, southern Colorado, parts of Utah in the springtime. And the prevailing winds in this part of the U.S. during that time of year were just like 20 miles an hour was a breeze. And I can remember driving westbound and being hit by southerly winds that would just tilt our vehicle at 40 to 45 miles an hour without any problem whatsoever. Now, if you have a situation similar to that, then obviously staking, depending on your soil conditions, obviously staking would make sense. You have a good strong stake on the windward side and a good strong stake on the leeward side. Loosely wrap it around the trunk. I used to always use tire and wire type of ties, and then I would nail the wire to the peeler core stake. And that always held them really well. But even in situations such as that, I wouldn't allow the stakes to be really tight to the tree. I would allow for some movement. And after, maybe a year or less, they shouldn't be on there. And so it's kind of a conundrum. I have to do it, but should I do it? How long do I do it? And why do I do it? And that's kind of like what we've covered today. Now, as far as materials out there, there's a lot of gimmicky things. But like I just said, the 2-inch peeler core, an 8-foot one, sometimes I cut it down 12 inches or so because I just couldn't drive it down into the soil any further. And if you have that same type of soil conditions, you can try guy wiring to rebar stakes and the like. Just make sure that whatever goes around the trunk of that tree is not an abrasive type of material. It has to be somewhat soft because things are going to move around. You don't want it to rub through the outside layer of the trunk and into the cambium layer where you end up damaging the tree. So it's kind of a push me, pull you when it comes to landscaping. But in the most part, it serves a purpose if you do it right. But get that crutch off that tree as soon as you can so that tree can really do a much better job. Remember, depending on the size of the tree that you're planting, that root ball, that moist, wet root ball that you're putting in the ground is going to be the biggest anchor you can have. Now, if you're planting bare root, then yeah, small stakes for the first 6 months makes sense. But a root ball, a balled and burlap type of situation, a container situation, you're going to dig that hole just slightly deeper than the root ball itself and half again as wide. You're going to mix that soil 50-50 with a good soil amendment, and you're going to use a good starter fertilizer. And then you're going to really firm up that planting hole when you put that soil back in there. I mean, stomp. I used to use 2x4s a lot, the end of a 2x4 to really tamp it down. A shovel handle worked, but I didn't like ruining my shovel handles. So a 2x4 worked really well. And then you're going to create your water basin. You're going to water it down in, and you can see all the additional weight, that additional anchor that's going to hold that in there. And then if you're staking, you want to go to just to the outside of that water basin, probably, I don't know, depending on the size you're planting, 12 inches away on either side, and then do your wire ties and call it good. But basically, my whole point is you don't always need it unless your environment dictates it. If you have a lot of windbreak from a mature forest, or you have a windbreak from neighbors' trees, you have a fence, maybe you got a 6 or 7 foot fence that blocks a majority of all the wind that comes into your landscape project, you can always hold off on that stake for a little while and see what happens. You'll generally always have one with a planter stake, one that comes with the tree already, and maybe that'll be enough for you. But for me, here at Brook and Pond, we went stakeless, and they're doing really well. There's nothing wrong with them. They've gone through probably 6 or 8 good windy days where they did get a little whipped, both with the leaves on and now with the leaves off, and we haven't had any issues. So I want that root zone to respond quickly, and I want that trunk to stiffen up as fast as possible, and it's doing a good job so far. So that's what I have for you today, guys. I really appreciate you tuning in. Any questions regarding this episode or any other landscape-related questions, feel free to email me, youryardcoach@gmail.com. Hey, jump over to the website this weekend because we do have a Black Friday sale. We knocked 30% off the book and 30% off the digital course.
Use code Black Friday 2024.
Which are fantastic DIY educational tools. I invite you to go take a look at that. And there's always the consultations and the designing. So until next week, as always, to your guys' landscape success. Hope to hear from you next week, and I'll catch you then. Bye for now.